Boy returns from heaven with a terrifying warning from Jesus. Ethan's revival was nothing short of a miracle, or so his mother, Grace, kept telling herself as she sat at his bedside, her hands trembling. The hospital room, sterile and unyielding, had grown eerily quiet after the doctors left, their faces pale with confusion. Ethan, only 17, had been declared dead just hours before, his heart giving out after a freak drowning accident at the lake. Yet here he was, sitting up, breathing, his pale blue eyes staring blankly at the wall as though he saw something far beyond it. He hadn't spoken a word since he woke. Grace reached out to touch his hand, but even that seemed like a transgression. His skin felt cold, unnaturally so, and she pulled her hand back instinctively. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Baby, can you hear me?" His head turned slowly, almost mechanically, to meet her gaze. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if it were dragging itself from the depths of his throat. "I saw him." The words froze the air in the room. Grace leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Saw who, sweetheart? You mean Jesus?" Ethan's lips parted, but no answer came. Instead, he blinked once, twice, and then tears streamed down his face, silent and unrelenting. Grace's maternal instincts took over, and she wrapped her arms around him despite the chill emanating from his body. He didn't resist, but he didn't return the embrace either. His body felt limp, as though his soul hadn't fully returned. "They won't believe me," Ethan whispered after a long pause. "Believe what, honey?" Grace asked, her voice desperate. "You can tell me. I'll believe you." But Ethan only shook his head. "It doesn't matter. It's already too late." The following morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched bowl of cereal before him. Grace hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. He hadn't eaten or slept since his return, and every word he spoke felt heavy, like it carried the weight of something Grace couldn't fathom. "What did you mean last night?" she ventured, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's too late?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver from the bowl. "The warnings," he murmured. "The ones he gave me." "Ethan," Grace said firmly, kneeling beside him. "You need to tell me what's going on. You're scaring me." At that, Ethan finally looked at her. His blue eyes, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed clouded, almost ethereal. "You'll see soon enough." The first sign came later that afternoon. Grace was folding laundry when she heard Ethan's voice from the living room. It wasn't loud or panicked, but it carried an urgency that made her drop the clothes in her hands and rush to him. He was standing by the window, staring at the sky. "It's starting," he said, almost to himself. Grace followed his gaze and gasped. The sky, once clear and blue, had turned an ominous shade of crimson. Clouds swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. The neighbors had begun stepping out of their homes, their heads tilted upward in confusion. Some pointed, others took out their phones to capture the phenomenon. Grace's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it. "Breaking news, unexplained atmospheric phenomenon over Midwest." "What's happening, Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer. He simply turned to her, his expression void of emotion. "It's him." By evening, the news was plastered with reports of strange occurrences across the globe. Birds were flocking in massive, erratic formations, crashing into buildings and vehicles. Rivers had begun running red in some areas, with scientists scrambling to explain the phenomenon as an algae bloom. But Ethan knew better, and so did Grace. The final straw came when Ethan began writing, pages upon pages of symbols and words in a language Grace couldn't understand. He worked feverishly, his hands moving as though possessed. The paper piled up on the kitchen table, the symbols growing more elaborate and ominous. Grace couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed his wrist mid-stroke, forcing him to look at her. "Ethan, you need to stop this. You're scaring me. What are you writing?" He looked down at the papers, then back at her, his expression eerily calm. "Instructions," he said simply. "For when it happens." "When what happens?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked to the door, opening it to reveal a night sky filled with flashing lights. Planes zipped across the horizon, military helicopters roaring overhead. The sound of sirens filled the air as the town erupted into chaos. "Why are they here?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "They know." "Know what?" "That it's already begun." Grace stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching as the lights in the sky grew brighter, closer. Helicopters thundered overhead, searchlights slicing through the night. The faint sound of a loudspeaker echoed from somewhere far off, but the words were muffled by the chaos erupting outside. People were running, neighbors she'd known for years now mere shadows against the chaos. They screamed, pointing at the sky, their panic infectious. "Ethan," Grace whispered, stepping back from the door. "What's happening? What do they know?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. His pale blue eyes, so eerily calm, stayed fixed on the helicopters. He moved forward, standing in the doorway, and for a moment Grace swore his silhouette didn't look like her son's. He seemed taller, broader, as though something else had taken root in him. "They're trying to stop it," Ethan said quietly. "But they can't." Grace grabbed his arm, desperate to pull him back inside, away from the chaos outside. "Stop what, Ethan? What are you talking about?" Ethan turned to face her, and for the first time since his return, there was something resembling sadness in his expression. "The signs," he said simply. "The warnings he told me to deliver." She didn't understand. How could she? Just 2 days ago, her son had been declared dead. She'd held his cold hand in the hospital, wept over his lifeless body. Now he was here, alive and speaking in riddles, foretelling disasters that made no sense. She wanted to believe this was all a nightmare, that she'd wake up any moment. But the chaos outside was real, and so was the strange, unearthly presence in her son's voice. "Ethan, I need you to make sense," she said, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "What signs? What warnings?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "He's coming," he said simply. The sirens grew louder, the chaos outside spilling into their quiet neighborhood. Soldiers appeared, their boots pounding against the pavement as they moved house to house, shouting for people to stay indoors. Grace could see one of them through the window, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. Whatever was happening, even they weren't prepared for it. The television blared in the background, the newscaster's voice shaky as she delivered updates. Unconfirmed reports of mass hysteria across the globe. Scientists are unable to explain the atmospheric anomalies, and officials are urging people to remain calm and indoors. The screen cut to static. Grace grabbed the remote, frantically pressing buttons, but the signal was gone. The power flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, the red glow of the sky cast an eerie light over everything, making shadows dance against the walls. "Mom," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. "You need to listen to me now." Grace turned to him, her heart pounding. "I'm listening, Ethan. Just tell me what's going on." He gestured to the stack of papers on the table, the ones filled with strange symbols and words she couldn't decipher. "You need to keep those safe," he said. "When they come, you'll need them." "When who comes?" Grace demanded, her voice rising. "Ethan, stop talking in riddles. You're scaring me." "They won't hurt you," he said, as though she hadn't spoken. "They'll try to convince you that I'm wrong, that this is all in your head. But you have to trust me, Mom. He showed me everything." Grace's knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest chair, her hands shaking. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Her son was alive. Against all odds, he'd come back to her. But the words coming out of his mouth were alien, terrifying. This wasn't the boy she'd raised. "Ethan," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who is he? What did he show you?" Ethan's expression darkened. He walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the sky. "He showed me what's going to happen," he said. "What they're doing, the lies they've told us. And what's waiting for them when he returns." Grace opened her mouth to speak, but a deafening roar cut her off. The house shook, the windows rattling as a massive aircraft passed overhead. It wasn't like any plane she'd ever seen, sleek and black, with lights that pulsed in unnatural patterns. It hovered for a moment, then descended slowly, landing in the field behind their house. "What is that?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't answer. He turned to her, his face pale but calm. "Stay here," he said. "Don't come outside, no matter what you hear." "No." Grace grabbed his arm, her fear turning into anger. "You're not going out there. Ethan, whatever this is, we'll face it together. But you're not leaving me." Ethan gently pried her fingers off his arm, his touch cold and unyielding. "You don't understand, Mom," he said. "This isn't about us. It never was." He walked to the door, his movements slow and deliberate. Grace followed, her heart pounding as she watched him step outside. The red light of the sky bathed him in an otherworldly glow, making him look almost spectral. "Ethan," she called after him, her voice cracking. But he didn't turn back. The aircraft's lights grew brighter, illuminating the field. Figures began to emerge, tall, humanoid shapes that moved with unnerving precision. They didn't look like soldiers, but they weren't entirely human either. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were almost mechanical. Grace clutched the door frame, her mind racing. She wanted to run after Ethan, to pull him back inside and protect him. But something about the figures in the field made her hesitate. There was a presence about them, something ancient and unyielding. Ethan stopped a few feet from the figures, his head tilted as though he were listening to something only he could hear. Then slowly he raised his hands. "Ethan!" Grace shouted again, but her voice was drowned out by another deafening roar as the aircraft's engines flared to life. The ground shook, and a blinding light erupted from the ship, forcing her to shield her eyes. When the light faded, Ethan and the figures were gone. Grace stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands trembled as she locked it, though she wasn't sure what good it would do. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened in Ethan's absence. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the strange aircraft as it disappeared into the red-tinged horizon. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Tears streamed down her face, but she barely noticed. The image of Ethan walking into the light, his figure dissolving into nothingness, was seared into her mind. She clutched at her chest, the ache in her heart unbearable. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had just come back to her, and now he was gone again. "Why?" she whispered to no one. "Why is this happening?" The papers on the table rustled, as though stirred by an unseen breeze. Grace's eyes snapped to them, her pulse quickening. She crawled toward the table, her hands shaking as she picked up the first sheet. The symbols were still incomprehensible, but now they seemed to glow faintly, as if imbued with a life of their own. She turned the page over, hoping for some explanation, and froze. There, written in Ethan's handwriting, were the words, "Trust him." Grace's stomach turned. The message felt more like a command than a reassurance. She looked at the stack of papers, dread pooling in her gut. She didn't know what they meant or who they were meant for, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that they were important, dangerously so. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, and Grace's head snapped up. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. She rose to her feet slowly, clutching one of the papers to her chest like a lifeline. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely steady. There was no response, just the sound of heavy boots shifting on the porch. Grace's heart raced. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. A man stood there, tall and imposing, dressed in black tactical gear. His face was obscured by a helmet, but the insignia on his chest was unmistakable, a government seal. Grace's blood ran cold. She stepped back from the window, her mind racing. They had come for Ethan. Or maybe they had come for her. Either way, she knew she couldn't let them in. The knock turned into pounding, the door rattling on its hinges. "Mrs. Harper, open the door," a voice barked. "We know you're in there." Grace backed away, clutching the paper tighter. She had no plan, no way out. Her house was surrounded, the street teeming with vehicles and armed men. She could hear them shouting orders, their voices echoing through the night. "Mrs. Harper, this is your last warning. Open the door, or we'll break it down." Her gaze darted to the back door, but she knew it was no use. They would have the house surrounded. Her only option was to stall, to buy herself time to think. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. "What do you want?" she called out. There was a pause, and then the voice responded, "We're here for the boy. We know he was with you. Hand over any evidence related to his return, and you won't be harmed." Grace's fingers tightened around the paper. She glanced at the stack on the table, her mind racing. They knew about Ethan. They knew about the papers. But how? And what did they want with him? "You're wasting your time," she shouted. "He's not here." Another pause. She could hear them murmuring to each other, their voices muffled. Then the voice spoke again, colder this time. "Mrs. Harper, open the door now." The pounding resumed, louder and more forceful. Grace's panic surged. She grabbed the stack of papers and shoved them into a bag, her movements frantic. She didn't know what she was going to do with them, but she couldn't let them fall into the wrong hands. The door gave a loud crack, and Grace knew she was out of time. She clutched the bag to her chest and ran toward the basement door. The only place left to hide was down there, among the clutter and darkness. She threw open the door and descended the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with dust. She crouched behind an old shelf, her breathing shallow as she listened to the sounds above. The door burst open, and heavy boots thundered through the house. "She has to be here somewhere," a voice growled. "Search every room." Grace's grip on the bag tightened. She bit her lip, trying to stay silent. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming down the stairs. Her mind raced. She couldn't let them find her. She couldn't let them take the papers. But what could she do? She was outnumbered, unarmed, and terrified. Then she remembered Ethan's words, "Trust him." Her gaze fell on the papers in the bag. She didn't understand them, but she knew they were important. She pulled one out, her hands trembling, and stared at the symbols. They seemed to pulse, as if responding to her fear. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. A flashlight beam swept across the basement, landing dangerously close to her hiding spot. Grace held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. "Anything?" one of the men called out. "Not yet," another replied. The beam moved away, and Grace let out a shaky breath. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. She had to do something, and she had to do it now. She closed her eyes and clutched the paper tightly, whispering a silent prayer. She didn't know who she was praying to or what she was asking for, but she needed help, desperately. Grace's whispered prayer barely left her lips when the paper in her hands began to shift. At first, she thought it was her trembling hands, but then she saw the symbols rearranging themselves, glowing faintly. The dim basement seemed to brighten, and the temperature dropped. The paper pulsed with energy, sending vibrations up her arm. The footsteps above her quickened, boots stomping on creaky floorboards as the search grew more aggressive. One of the men shouted, "She's not on this floor. Check the basement." Her heart sank. They were coming for her. Grace clutched the bag tightly, her mind racing. The paper in her hands was alive. She could feel its power coursing through her. But what was it doing? And how could it help her now? The basement door creaked open, and the sound of heavy boots descending the stairs filled the air. Grace pressed herself further into the shadows behind the old shelf, every muscle in her body taut with fear. She glanced at the glowing paper in her hands, silently willing it to give her a sign, a way out, anything. The men reached the bottom of the stairs, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The beams darted across the cluttered space, illuminating cobwebs, old furniture, and boxes stacked haphazardly. Grace held her breath, her fingers gripping the edges of the paper so tightly that it crumpled slightly. "There's no way she got out," one of the men said, his voice low and gravelly. "Keep looking." The other man's flashlight swept across the basement, landing dangerously close to Grace's hiding spot. She froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. The paper in her hands grew warmer, the glow intensifying. She risked a glance down at it and saw that the symbols had fully rearranged into what looked like a map, or perhaps a set of instructions. But there was no time to decipher it. The beam of light suddenly stopped, aimed directly at the shelf. "Over here," one of the men shouted. Grace's body moved on instinct. She shoved the paper back into the bag and bolted from her hiding spot, darting toward the opposite corner of the basement. Shouts erupted behind her, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the concrete floor. "There she is," one of them bellowed. Grace's lungs burned as she sprinted through the maze of clutter. She reached the far wall, only to find herself cornered. The basement's layout offered no escape, just cold, unforgiving walls and a small, high window that was far out of reach. "End of the line," one of the men sneered, stepping into view. His flashlight beam was blinding, forcing Grace to shield her eyes. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the other man said, his voice dripping with menace. "Hand over the papers and we'll let you go." Grace's mind raced. She couldn't let them take the papers. Whatever Ethan had brought back from the other side, it was too important to fall into the wrong hands. But what could she do? She was outnumbered and trapped. Then she felt it, a presence, warm and steady, like a hand on her shoulder. She turned her head slightly, but there was no one there. Yet the sensation remained, calming her racing heart and steadying her trembling hands. The men advanced, their flashlights bobbing as they closed in. Grace's back was against the wall now, her bag clutched tightly to her chest. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the unseen presence washing over her. She didn't know where the feeling came from, but she trusted it. One of the men lunged toward her, his hand outstretched. In that instant, the paper in her bag pulsed with blinding light, illuminating the entire basement. The man recoiled with a shout, shielding his eyes. His partner stumbled back, cursing loudly. "What the?" one of them started, but his words were cut off by a deafening rumble. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the walls seemed to vibrate. Boxes toppled, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The light from the paper grew even brighter, forcing Grace to squint as she held the bag close. The men scrambled to regain their footing, their flashlights clattering to the ground. "What is this?" one of them shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Grace didn't respond. She was transfixed by the light, which now seemed to form a shape in the air before her. It was faint and indistinct at first, but it quickly solidified into a figure that radiated authority and power. The men froze, their eyes wide with terror. "Is that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. It towered over them, its features obscured by the blinding light. Grace could feel its gaze on her, piercing and all-knowing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt a strange sense of reassurance, as if the figure was on her side. The men dropped to their knees, their faces pale. "We didn't know," one of them stammered. "We didn't know what we were dealing with." The figure raised a hand, and the ground stopped shaking. The light dimmed slightly, enough for Grace to see the men trembling before it. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to move. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the paper in Grace's bag. The basement was silent once more, the only sound the labored breathing of the men. Grace didn't wait for them to recover. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the ground and swung it toward the nearest man. The clang of metal against his helmet sent him sprawling, and she didn't hesitate to turn toward the other. Grace didn't stop to assess the damage. Her survival instincts had taken over entirely, fueled by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The second man stumbled backward as she swung the pipe in his direction, the echo of metal scraping against concrete filling the room. His flashlight beam jittered wildly as he tried to steady himself, but Grace had no intention of giving him the chance. She advanced, swinging the pipe with all the force she could muster. He ducked and lunged forward, grabbing for her bag. Grace twisted her body to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp, and brought her knee up into his stomach. He let out a pained grunt, doubling over, but he still managed to grab hold of the strap of her bag. The tug-of-war began, both of them grappling for control. Grace's hands burned as the strap cut into her palms, but she refused to let go. Her mind flashed to Ethan's face, to the unshakable conviction in his eyes when he told her the world depended on what was inside. She couldn't lose it, not now, not ever. "Let go," the man barked, his voice strained with effort. Sweat dripped down his face as he yanked harder, trying to wrest the bag from her grasp. "Never," Grace spat through gritted teeth, planting her feet firmly on the ground. She twisted the strap in her hands, using his momentum against him. With a final, desperate pull, she managed to send him stumbling backward, the bag still clutched tightly to her chest. The first man, still dazed from the blow to his helmet, began to stir on the ground. Grace knew she had only seconds before he regained his bearings. Her gaze darted around the basement, searching for anything she could use to secure her escape. Her eyes landed on a rusty ladder leaning against the far wall, leading up to a small, half-broken window near the ceiling. It was a long shot, but it was her only chance. She bolted for the ladder, her footsteps pounding against the concrete. The second man lunged after her, his fingers brushing against the strap of her bag, but she was faster. She grabbed the ladder and began to climb, the rusted metal creaking ominously under her weight. "Stop her," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The other scrambled to his feet, his flashlight beam locking onto her. Grace's heart raced as she climbed, her hands slipping on the rusty rungs. The ladder swayed slightly, and she felt a surge of panic. If it gave out, she'd be trapped, and there would be no second chance. She forced herself to keep going, her muscles screaming in protest. The second man reached the base of the ladder and began to climb after her. "You're not getting away with this," he snarled, his hand reaching for her ankle. Grace kicked out instinctively, her foot connecting with his chest. He lost his grip and fell backward, crashing to the ground with a thud. But the first man was already on his feet, and he wasn't far behind. The window was just within reach now, its jagged edges glinting in the dim light. Grace shoved the bag through the opening, then hoisted herself up. The metal scraped against her knees and arms as she wriggled through, but she didn't care. She could feel the cool night air on her face, and it was the only thing that mattered. Just as she pulled herself through the window, a hand clamped down on her ankle. "Not so fast," the first man growled, his grip like iron. Grace screamed, thrashing wildly. Her free foot connected with his hand, and she felt his grip loosen. With a final, desperate effort, she kicked again, sending him tumbling back into the basement. She didn't wait to see if he got up. She grabbed the bag and took off into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The city was eerily quiet, the streets bathed in the sickly orange glow of streetlights. Grace's footsteps echoed as she ran, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop, couldn't look back. The paper in her bag pulsed faintly, its glow barely visible through the fabric. Grace could feel its presence, a strange warmth that seemed to guide her. She didn't understand what it wanted from her, but she trusted it. She had no choice. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The men were still after her, their shouts cutting through the silence like knives. Grace ducked into an alley, pressing herself against the wall. She held her breath, listening as they ran past, their voices fading into the distance. She slumped to the ground, her body trembling. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, her fingers clutching the bag as if it were a lifeline. She had made it out, but she knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The paper in her bag pulsed again, stronger this time. Grace pulled it out, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. The symbols on the page seemed to dance before her eyes, rearranging themselves into something new. A name, an address. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the name, but the address was only a few blocks away. Was this where she was supposed to go? Was this the next step? Grace pushed herself to her feet, the weight of the bag pressing against her shoulder. She didn't know what she would find at the address, but she knew she had to go. She couldn't stop now. As she stepped out of the alley and into the street, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She froze, her eyes scanning the darkness. Someone was watching her. She could feel it. The streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional car speeding past in the distance. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, her senses heightened. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, tailing her through the night. Every sound, every rustle in the wind, made her jump, made her look over her shoulder. But there was nothing. No one. Her breath was shallow, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She wanted to stop, to find a safe place, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she got to the address on the paper. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this was no coincidence. The paper had led her this far, and now it was telling her where to go. The alleyways she passed seemed to grow darker the further she ventured. The usual city sounds, car engines, voices in the distance, the hum of streetlights, were muffled. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The address was drawing nearer, but something felt wrong. She had passed countless side streets, each one more desolate than the last. It wasn't like her usual route home. There were no shops, no bustling crowds. The city felt empty, like a ghost town. She turned a corner, and there it was, an old, nondescript building tucked between two high rises. The address matched exactly. The glass doors were cracked, the neon sign flickering above her. A slight shiver ran down her spine. Grace's footsteps faltered. The building was abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless. The door was slightly ajar, and she could feel an inexplicable pull to enter. Her instincts screamed for her to turn around, to run as far as she could, but she had come too far. She had to know. The paper in her bag pulsed again, stronger this time. It was as if it were calling to her, urging her forward. Swallowing her fear, Grace pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside was colder than she expected. Dimly lit, with broken furniture scattered haphazardly around. There was dust in the air, thick enough to make her cough. She squinted into the gloom, looking for any sign of life. The place was empty, no lights, no people, just the oppressive silence. Her footsteps echoed eerily as she moved through the room, her eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place. The only sound was the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back corner, barely noticeable over the buzzing of the flickering light overhead. The paper in her hand seemed to glow faintly now, as if it were guiding her. She walked toward the back of the room, where the refrigerator hummed louder. But there was no refrigerator, no walls, just a wide, unmarked door that had been hidden by a curtain. Grace's pulse quickened as she approached the door, the heavy silence pressing down on her. She could feel her heart racing, each step feeling like a slow crawl toward the unknown. The door was a faded gray, slightly warped, and there were no markings on it, no indication of what lay behind it. Taking a deep breath, Grace reached for the handle. She hesitated for a split second, wondering what would happen if she opened it. What was on the other side? Her mind was racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. She turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust and a stale, metallic odor. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, but then her eyes caught something. A figure in the far corner. A man. A silhouette. His back was to her, his shoulders hunched. He seemed familiar, though she couldn't place him. He was standing in front of a desk, papers scattered all around him. He seemed to be looking at something intently, but as Grace stepped further into the room, the man turned, slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man she had seen in the vision. The one she had been searching for. His face was worn, but it was unmistakable. His eyes were hollow, as if something deep within them had been stripped away. "You've come," he said in a gravelly voice. It was as if he had been expecting her. Grace took a step back. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked toward her, his footsteps heavy. The silence between them grew thicker, the tension mounting. "You came because you were meant to," he said, his voice soft but laced with urgency. "You've seen what's coming, haven't you?" Grace nodded slowly, still in shock. The man stopped in front of her, his gaze intense. "The world is falling apart. But it's not just what you think. It's more. It's worse. And you need to hear it. You need to be the one to warn them." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Grace felt a chill settle over her. She had heard whispers, rumors about what was happening around the world, political unrest, climate disasters, social upheaval, but this felt different. This felt like something deeper. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man stepped closer. There are forces at play that you don't understand. And your role in all of this, is to make them listen. They won't, not at first. But when they realize what's coming, it will be too late. Before Grace could speak, the man grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes burned into hers, pleading. "You have to stop him." Grace's confusion deepened. "Stop who?" "Trump," the man whispered. "You have to stop Trump. He's at the center of everything. He's the key to everything that's coming." Grace's mind was spinning as the man's words echoed in her ears. Stop Trump? She had heard plenty of talk, rumors, and accusations, but never had she imagined someone would say those words so directly to her. Trump, the former president, the divisive figure whose name had been in the headlines for years. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. What did he have to do with the catastrophic events she had been warned about? And why was this man, this stranger, so insistent? She pulled her arm away from him gently, her thoughts racing as she tried to regain some composure. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "What does he have to do with all this?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of sadness in his eyes, like he was waiting for her to understand something she couldn't yet comprehend. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "He's been playing a game," the man said finally, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "But the stakes are higher than you could ever imagine. And it's not just his actions, it's everything around him. Everything he touches." Grace stared at him, feeling a strange mix of fear and confusion. She had grown up hearing about conspiracy theories, about people warning of the end times, but this felt different. This felt real. The intensity in his eyes told her he wasn't making it up. "What do you mean, everything he touches?" she asked, trying to make sense of it all. The man's expression darkened. "It's more than just politics. It's the environment. It's the economy. It's even the social fabric that's tearing apart. It all leads back to him. He's been laying the groundwork for this chaos for years." The words sent a chill down Grace's spine. Laying the groundwork? The thought gnawed at her. She had always been skeptical of conspiracy theories, of people who painted the world with a broad brush of blame, but what if he was telling the truth? "What's going to happen?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man glanced toward the window, his gaze distant. "The world will start to unravel. What you've seen so far is just the beginning. Natural disasters, political unrest, economic collapse. The climate will shift. People will panic. And it will all come to a head when they realize what's been happening behind the scenes." His words were like a dark prophecy, a weighty prediction of doom. Grace felt the air grow heavy in the room, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unease creeping up on her. "But why me? Why are you telling me this? What can I do?" The man locked eyes with her, his expression somber. "Because you're the only one who can get people to listen. You've seen it, haven't you? You've seen the signs. You've felt the shift in the world, the growing tension. You can't ignore it anymore. You need to warn them. It's the only chance they have." Grace felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. The weight of his words settled over her like a cloak she couldn't escape. She had always known something was off. The growing division, the climate disasters, the collapse of institutions, she'd felt it all, but had dismissed it as the growing pains of a fractured world. Now it all seemed so much darker. But Trump? What did he have to do with all of this? She opened her mouth to ask more, but before she could speak, the man raised his hand to silence her. "Listen," he said urgently. "You don't have much time. The clock is ticking. They'll come for you soon. They'll try to stop you from spreading the message. But you have to stay strong. You have to speak out. No matter what." Grace took a step back, her mind reeling. "Who will come for me? Who are you?" She felt like she was drowning in confusion, her body tense with a fear she couldn't explain. The man took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. "I'm someone who's seen the future. I know what's coming. And I know that you're the key to stopping it. You have to make people believe. You have to make them see the truth before it's too late." The silence between them was deafening. Grace felt her hands tremble as she gripped the edges of the paper in her bag. The vision she had seen earlier, the warning from God, flashed in her mind. It was all connected, she realized. This man, the prophecy, the warning, everything was falling into place. But how? How could she be the one to stop it all? Where do I even begin? Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man met her gaze with a steely intensity. Start with him. Start with Trump. Expose him. Show the world what he's been hiding. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to grow even heavier, thick with the weight of the man's words. Grace swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. The truth was right in front of her, but it was terrifying. How could she expose someone like him? Someone so powerful? And what would it mean for her? The man seemed to sense her hesitation, his eyes softening for a moment. You'll have to be brave. The truth isn't easy to face, but it's the only way forward. Grace stood there for a long moment, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. She had a choice to make, one that would change everything. Her gaze flickered toward the door. The world outside seemed so far away, yet so close. The future was uncertain, but she knew she had to act before it was too late. Okay, Grace said, her voice shaking but determined. I'll do it. The man nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Good. Now go. The world needs you. Grace walked out of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The streets outside felt colder than usual, the autumn air biting against her skin as she hurried to her car. It was as if the world itself had sensed the shift, as if everything around her was closing in on her. She couldn't believe it even now. The man's words haunted her every step. Expose Trump. Make them see the truth. But how? How could she possibly take on someone so powerful, so entrenched in the world systems? She had no platform, no army to back her up. It was just her, one woman, alone with a message she wasn't sure anyone would believe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Grace glanced down to see a message from her best friend, Anna. Hey, I just heard about the riots downtown. Are you okay? Stay safe. Grace's thumb hovered over the screen, her mind racing. Riots? Another wave of dread washed over her. She had heard the news about the civil unrest, the growing protests across the country, but the fear in Anna's text made it feel all too real. She typed a quick reply, telling Anna she was fine, but she wasn't sure she was being truthful. The tension in the air felt thick, like a storm was brewing just on the horizon. As she slid into the driver's seat of her car, she started the engine, the rumble of the engine filling the quiet street. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind kept replaying the man's warning. You have to stop them. Expose Trump. How did he expect her to do that? How could anyone expose someone as powerful and connected as the former president? Her thoughts swirled, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything, the strange vision, the warning from beyond, the rising tensions in the world, was leading to something she couldn't avoid. She glanced at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see someone tailing her. It was silly, but she felt paranoid, as if she was being watched. The man had told her that the clock was ticking, that they'd come for her. She wasn't sure, but the fear that gripped her heart told her it was more than just a warning. She had to act quickly. Grace drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights flickering in the distance as she tried to collect her thoughts. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert from a news app. Breaking news: riots intensify. Protesters clash with police across major cities. Chaos spreads. Citizens demand action. Her stomach dropped. Riots. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been hearing about the unrest for weeks, but seeing the escalation, knowing it was getting worse, brought the prophecy to life. The world was unraveling, just as the man had said. She had to find a way to get people to listen. But where would she even start? She had no voice in the public sphere. She was just an ordinary woman, trying to survive in an increasingly unstable world. Who would take her seriously? Grace's thoughts were interrupted when she saw a large, glowing billboard ahead. It was an advertisement for the upcoming presidential election, featuring none other than Donald Trump's face. The words beneath it read, The future of America is in your hands. Vote for the strength of America. She felt her blood boil. The election, the looming decisions that would shape the next few years. This was it. This was the moment the man had warned her about. If she didn't act, if she didn't expose what was happening behind the scenes, everything could be lost. Her heart raced as she continued driving, the city's skyline looming over her. But it wasn't just the city she had to worry about anymore. It was the entire world. What would happen if Trump was allowed to continue? Her hands tightened on the wheel as the realization hit her. The violence, the destruction, the loss of control. It wasn't random. It was part of a plan. A plan that had been set in motion long before she had ever even realized. And now, she was in the middle of it. Her phone buzzed once more. It was Anna again. "Grace, please tell me you're okay. You're scaring me. Are you still at home?" Grace read the message and paused. She couldn't stay home. She couldn't sit idly by while the world fell apart. She had a message to deliver, a prophecy to share. She typed a quick response to Anna, "I'll be fine. Just need to take care of something. Stay safe. Love you." With a deep breath, Grace pulled her car into the nearest parking garage. Her palms were slick with sweat, but there was no turning back now. The man's warning, Jesus' warning, had set her on this path, and she had no choice but to follow it. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but she knew she had to speak out. She had to stand up for the future. For humanity's future. As she exited the car, the wind picked up, a chill cutting through the air. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, the weight of what was ahead sinking in. The streets were eerily quiet, and the sound of distant sirens grew louder as she walked. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Grace's footsteps echoed in the empty parking garage, the only sound that seemed to break the silence. She was headed somewhere. Somewhere she wasn't sure she could go alone. She pulled out her phone, checking for any messages or news updates. The world was unraveling faster than she could keep up with, and she had a responsibility to stop it. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a news alert. Breaking news. President Donald Trump orders military intervention in cities across the nation. Protests intensify. Her heart sank as she read the words, the weight of the message sinking in. It was happening, just as the man had said. The pieces were falling into place. Grace took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined to make her stand. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't walk away.